Okay, great. Thanks, Joanne, Tom, and all of you who are here. On the panel so far, we've discussed quite a few of the constraints that Syriza faces in reversing austerity in the next few months. Syriza, of course, is negotiating from a position of weakness, but at the same time, the various reactions we're seeing from the European elite reveal the tricky dilemma that they face too. Either they could agree to a debt write-down and risk a domino effect that would create openings for other countries.
It's echoing a little bit, so try.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Okay, let me know if it's too echoey.
A little further from the mic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry. Haven't spoken to this large of a crowd before, so thank you for the encouragement. So, let me go over the dilemma again. Either they could agree to a debt write-down and risk a domino effect that would create openings for other countries to challenge the terms of their sovereign debt. Or they could play hardball, and if Syriza doesn't back down, kick Greece out of the Eurozone, which would risk a different kind of domino effect, where other peripheral economies would consider exit and default options. The situation is too fluid to predict what will happen, but I remain somewhat optimistic, given that the European and especially German elite would rather have a monetary union with some debt restructuring than no monetary union at all. Herein lies Greece's potential leverage. I think we can anticipate the EU and ECB to continue to stretch the situation to its limits, resorting to the kind of blackmail that we've seen in the past few days, but knowing full well that in the final hour, Syriza ultimately might secure a debt write-down or swap or some equivalent. I agree that it's a big if, but if mobilizations persist and Syriza stands firm, such an outcome will not only transform the crisis in Greece, but really shift the balance of power in Europe. You might be wondering, why would the German elite opt for Eurozone light and not find a way to trigger a Eurozone collapse to their benefit? In other words, why preserve the monetary union if the left manages to tinker with it? I would argue that though there's room for Greece and potential allies to change certain structures around loans and investments, there's a very important mechanism that can't be changed unless German capital is challenged on its home turf, namely through an uptick in labor militancy and the rise of the German left. And German elites assume, quite rightly in my opinion, that politically this won't be a possibility for a while. That mechanism is wage compression, which the economist and now Syriza MP Kostas Vgontzas has greatly focused his critique of the Eurozone on. German capital has been compressing wages since the formation of the monetary union, but we have to go back a bit further to really understand its significance. We should recall that Germany was one of the leading post-war industrial producers, competing largely against the United States and Japan. As we know from the economic historian Robert Brenner, industrial overcapacity resulting from this competition led to the profit crisis of the 1970s. Since then, each major set of producers has sought to recover from this crisis in different ways. In the United States, as we know, we have seen manufacturing greatly phased out and replaced by the rise of dollarization, to which its regional orbit is especially subject. Germany and Japan, on the other hand, retained a greater share of their industrial capacity, and their own regional orbits were primed to be expanded as export markets. The Eurozone has only deepened this dynamic, with wage compression used to keep German exports competitive, the demand for which was maintained by massive amounts of lending in the periphery. The upshot here is that there has to be a coordination of wage adjustment policies to fundamentally break the cycle of trade imbalances in the Eurozone. So how does that analysis square with Syriza's long-term strategy? To briefly summarize their position, the dominant faction leading Syriza views the European Union as a place where the left can consolidate executive power and turn Europe into a progressive project of political cooperation. The now nearly legendary finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, has extended this logic even further. I'm sorry, I would just like to get some water. I'm worried that I'm going to dry up on you. No, it's okay. So Varoufakis has extended this logic even further by arguing that the Eurozone itself can be reformed to the benefit of all its members. He's articulated what he's called a modest proposal that consists largely of quantitative easing and restored investment throughout the Eurozone. The key is that these reforms would be powered by the industrial heart of Europe, that is Germany. Indeed, Varoufakis has said that Europe, quote, needs a hegemonic Germany that would push for savings to be shifted to productive activities, even in the periphery. But now we're back to our earlier problem, which is that even if mechanisms of quantitative easing and investment are introduced, wages won't be adjusted unless German capital is forced to adjust them. And again, that won't happen unless there's a government in Germany representing popular interests. In the meantime, peripheral economies will remain trade deficit economies subjected to the regional orbit of the core. It's a kind of neoliberal straitjacket in which efforts of transitioning to an alternative growth model will be greatly constrained, if not impossible. So while we must strive for an internationalist left, and I agree that the divide is between the have and the have-nots and not the north and south, for progressive and we have to, in that vein, strive for a progressive Europe, we have to be cognizant of the limits created by the current political conditions of the core. Now, at this point in the conversation, I'm usually asked, given what the political situation is, given the humanitarian crisis, given people's concerns about the boat being rocked too far, too fast, how much can we ask of the left at this point? It's a legitimate question. Indeed, there's an appealing political logic on Syriza's part to reclaim some hope for the Greek people while eschewing the fears that might emerge in positing a more radical break at this point, especially when over half the population remains in favor of staying in the Eurozone. I do think that several years ago, Syriza did miss an opportunity to really engage people on this question. But now, after a period of considerable decline in popular mobilization, it seems that the most politically sound option is to attack austerity while assuring some kind of stability. Part of that strategy for Syriza includes not exiting the Eurozone at a moment where the left would take much of the blame for its immediate aftermath. It's a different situation if they try all that they can to negotiate and then come to a point where they either must capitulate or will be forced out. In that sense, we could view Syriza's strategy as a kind of gradualism necessary for the moment. So assuming that Syriza does not capitulate, there are two possible outcomes. One, Greece is forced out of the Eurozone. Or two, it stays in the Union and gets the debt write-down, but ultimately the fundamental Eurozone dynamic of trade imbalances remain intact. Of course, in the first scenario, Syriza necessarily will need a plan B. But I hope to have shown why even in the second scenario, it might still need a plan B. Because if the left cannot make the economy more productive, the game-changing gains that might be secured from this current battle might be reversed in the next crisis. And the little hope that people have left that's been rekindled will be lost. There happens to be a sizable force in Syriza that has articulated its position, and Yannis pointed them out, the left platform. They've offered blueprints for an alternative, and Vgontzas is one of those people who's articulated it. Vgontzas' plan, or under a Vgontzas plan, the country would nationalize its banks, impose capital controls, and devalue its currency to increase export competitiveness. The most updated version of this can be found in a book that Versa released on the day of the elections. This strategy would give the Greek government much more autonomy for fiscal expansion and moreover for compelling capital to invest in productive activities. It would allow the left, in other words, to pursue an alternative growth model. All of this, of course, would necessarily be undergirded by continued popular support and a deepening of working class formation. For the sake of time, I won't get into all of the details, but I would be more than happy to continue the conversation in the Q&A. What I'll say for now is that there are, I think, 3 points that are understated when this debate happens. The first is that the Greek state is now more than ever in the position of disciplining capital, and by that I mean compelling capital to invest in productive activities. This is because, quite simply, there is now a section of Greek capital in whose interest it is not to leave Greece. Greek capital today is not just the Onasidas who in the 50s and 60s could take their ships to other locations. Sure, there are oligarchs, but those oligarchs rely on airwaves, the stadiums, metal plants, and might even see new investment opportunities in transport, pharmaceuticals, solar, and wind energy, and other sectors if the appropriate industrial policy is applied. It's important to note the motivation of Greek elites in entering the Eurozone, which arguably was to exploit markets in their own regional orbit in the Balkans. This, however, proved to be a bad gamble, as the only sector that has profited from the Balkans of Greek capital was banking. So these other businesses, again, are bound to Greece, at least in the short term, and can be incentivized to stay in the long term. The second point is that this long-term industrial policy is actually on the cards now because we have a Greek state that for the first time is committed to attacking bourgeois corruption. Due to a number of structural reasons and political contingencies, the Greek post-war governments pursued a rather bastardized version of planning. And though this was at least rhetorically the project of PASOK when it took power in the 1980s, because of its commitments to the political class, that goal was dropped by the end of the decade in favor of stabilization. But this government has no such commitments, and we can rely on it to actually discipline capital. The third point is that in this global economy, Europe is not the only partner around, or shall I say Northern Europe isn't. And in fact, there are a number of countries that would be happy to counterpose against the Eurozone, and that don't have the interest or capacity in subjecting Greece to their regional orbit. Our friends in the pink tide of Latin America come to mind here, whose state-society relations Syriza has largely modeled itself after. Let me put it differently. In the abstract, especially to somebody who grew up after the dismantling of welfare states, a second New Deal in Europe sounds great. But I hope to have shown why that cannot occur under the current political context. Now that the left is in power in Greece, it must take the steps to strengthen the organizational capacities of the popular classes in the long term. And the truth is that a working class that is highly fragmented and an economy